The coffee at Coyote Flats Diner was never anything special, and Megan Pruitt had stopped pretending otherwise about 3 years into the job. 7 years behind the same counter, refilling the same mismatched mugs, listening to the same country station that played at the same volume above the kitchen pass-through, like a river that had forgotten how to change course. The diner sat 12 miles outside Flagstaff on a two-lane road that most GPS systems tried to reroute you away from. The sign out front had been missing its second T for so long that locals had started calling the place Coyote Flats, without irony, and the name had stuck the way names stuck in small places by repetition and the slow erosion of the original thing. The parking lot lights buzzed and flickered like they were always considering giving up, but never quite committing to it. Tonight, the lot was full. Megan had counted the bikes when she pulled in for her 10 o'clock shift. 41 motorcycles arranged in the careful, deliberate way that men who took their machines seriously always arranged them, not scattered the way civilian vehicles scattered, but organized, each one given its space, its angle, its dignity. She had stood beside her car for a moment longer than she needed to, just looking. She had worked this diner through thunderstorms and highway accidents, and the occasional drunk who wandered in from the interstate looking for something he couldn't name. She had never seen 41 motorcycles in this parking lot. She had never seen 41 motorcycles in one place outside of a rally, and even then the feeling had been different, dispersed across a larger space diluted by distance. Here in this small, cracked asphalt lot under buzzing lights, they had a different quality entirely. Something concentrated, something with mass. She recognized some of the regulars when she pushed through the door. Men who came through a few times a year heading somewhere or coming back from somewhere, always vague about the details in the way of people who understood that the details were not what mattered. They tipped better than the suits from the highway hotels ever did, and they never snapped their fingers at her, and they always said thank you, which in Megan's experience put them ahead of a significant percentage of the population. But most of these men she had never seen before. They filled every booth, every stool at the counter, and had pushed 3 tables together near the back to seat a group of 12 who were louder than the rest combined, not in a troubling way, in the way of men who were deeply comfortable with each other and had been somewhere together and were still inside the warmth of having done it. The patches on their jackets told her what she needed to know. She had been working roadside diners long enough to read patches the way other people read weather. Hell's Angels, a full chapter riding together, stopping for the night after a charity run out of Phoenix. She caught pieces of it from the counter as she moved through the first hour of her shift. Money raised for veterans' families' medical bills that the government had decided weren't its problem anymore. Children who had grown up in the specific silence of a house where a father's name was spoken carefully. One of the older riders, a man with a gray-streaked beard and forearms covered in work, the decades had softened but not erased, had shown her a photograph on his phone without being asked, like he needed someone outside the group to see it. A little girl at a ceremony, a folded flag, a face that had not yet learned what the flag meant. Megan had looked at the photograph for a long moment. She had refilled his coffee without being asked. The diner was loud in the best way. Loud with laughter and the scraping of plates and an argument near the back about the best route through the eastern part of New Mexico that had the volume and conviction of a debate about something that actually mattered. Someone at the back table was insisting with great passion that his bike could outrun anything on the road, which was being contested with equal passion by at least 4 other men who appeared to have strong opinions in the evidence to support them. Megan moved through all of it with the easy rhythm of someone who had learned that the size of a crowd was never what made a night difficult. What made a night difficult was the feeling in your gut. The thing that didn't have a name but that your body understood before your mind caught up, the thing that told you when a room had changed quality without changing noise level. She didn't feel anything like that at 10. She didn't feel it at 11. She felt it at 12 minutes past midnight when the door opened and something in the room shifted. Not the noise level, the quality of it. Like a frequency had changed something below hearing something you registered in your chest before your ears processed it. She was at the far end of the counter when it happened, reaching for the coffee pot, and she turned more from instinct than intention, and she saw them. Two men, young. The taller one was maybe 28 with hollow cheeks and eyes that were moving too fast, cataloging the room in the way eyes moved when they were looking for leverage, not for a table. Exits, faces, the register behind the counter, the hallway leading to the back, the nearest booth, and how many people were between him and it. His name was Ethan Rowe, though Megan would not learn that for hours. Right now, he was just a man in a dark jacket with something held inside his right hand that he hadn't raised yet, but that everyone in the room who looked at him understood was there the same way you understood. A storm was coming before a single drop fell. The shorter one was younger, 24 maybe. His hands were shaking, not slightly, visibly. He was working hard to control it, and his body was refusing to cooperate. And Megan could see the effort from 15 feet away, and she thought, without quite meaning to think anything at all, that he looked terrified. Not dangerous, terrified. Terrified. The way a person looked when they had swum out far past the point where they could see the bottom and had only just understood what that meant. His name was Tyler Voss. "Nobody move." Ethan's voice was steadier than his partner's hands. He had clearly said those words before, or rehearsed them enough that they arrived with a kind of mechanical confidence, stripped of feeling, built for function. He stepped forward into the room. Tyler moved to his right, flanking toward the counter, and Megan's hands went up on pure reflex, no thought behind it, just the body making its oldest decisions. And then something strange happened. Nothing else did. The diner, which had been roaring with conversation 30 seconds earlier, went so quiet that Megan could hear the parking lot lights buzzing through the wall. Chairs scraped once, two of them adjustments. Someone near the back said something low and short, not panicked, just a word, the kind of word that meant something specific to the people who understood it. And then absolute silence. Nobody screamed. Nobody dove for the floor. Nobody rushed the door. Nobody reached for anything. 40 Hells Angels looked at the two men who had just walked into their diner and did not move and did not flinch, and their eyes held the particular quality of men who were assessing a situation rather than reacting to one, which was an entirely different thing and produced an entirely different silence. A silence that did not feel like the silence of fear at all. Ethan felt it before he understood it. He had walked into gas stations, a convenience store on the south side of Tucson, once a check-cashing place on the east side that he did not let himself think about for long. Every time the response had been the same. That electric snap of control established by terror people, shrinking voices disappearing, the room rearranging itself around the threat like water around a stone. Simple, reliable. The only reliable thing in his life for the past 3 months. This was not that. The men in this diner did not shrink. Their eyes did not go wide. They turned and looked at him with the measured, unhurried attention of people who were not afraid of him. And the specific weight of that, the sheer unexpected gravity of a room full of people who were simply not afraid, was more disorienting than anything Ethan Rowe had prepared himself for. He had prepared for screaming. He had prepared for compliance. He had prepared in the darkest corner of his thinking for something physical. He had not prepared for 40 men looking at him with the patient, almost clinical attention of people waiting to see what he would do next. He had not prepared to feel small. Tyler grabbed his arm. "Register," he said, voice tight. "Tell her again." Ethan looked back at Megan. "Open it." Megan's fingers found the register keys. Her body doing the work while her mind floated somewhere else entirely, hovering above the scene the way minds went to work when the body needed all available resources for simpler tasks. Her fingers knew the register. Her fingers had opened it 10,000 times. She let them do it. The man in the center booth had not turned around. She noticed him because he was the only person in the room who hadn't looked toward the door when Ethan and Tyler came in. Every other person, every single one, had turned. This man was still drinking his coffee. He was facing the wall, his back to the room, his shoulders relaxed in the specific way of a man who was either unaware or unconcerned, and something in the set of those shoulders told Megan it was not unawareness. He was a big man, Not in a gym-built way, not the size that came from effort and intention, but in the way of a person whose body had accumulated mass and density through decades of physical work, the way old timber did through compression and exposure and the slow addition of years. His hair was more silver than it had probably been once cut short and practical. His jacket matched everyone else's in the room, but the patches on it were different, arranged differently. More of them in a configuration that clearly meant something specific to everyone in the room, even if it meant nothing yet to the two young men near the door. His name was Jack Calhoun. He was 52 years old. He had been chapter president for 11 years, which meant he had been elected by men who did not elect anyone easily, and he had been re-elected 3 times, which meant he had continued to be the kind of man those men wanted, making decisions when decisions mattered. Before the Chapter 2 tours and places he still referred to only by their general geography in mixed company. Before that, nearly a decade as a union ironworker, until his knees developed opinions he was no longer able to overrule. He had sat across from things that would have emptied the nerve from most men permanently, and those experiences had not made him hard, exactly not hardened in the brittle way, but they had made him absolutely and completely still, in the way of something that had been tested enough times to know what it was made of. He lifted his mug, he drank. "Hey!" Ethan's voice cracked the silence. "You, in the booth. Turn around." Jack did not answer immediately. He set his mug down on the table with a small, deliberate sound and looked at it for a moment the way a man looked at something he was considering before he turned. When he turned, he did it slowly. He looked at Ethan Rowe across the length of the diner with the complete, absolute absence of alarm. "I heard you," Jack said. "Then turn around when I'm talking to you." "I just did." The words were simple. The delivery was simpler. No edge in them, no performance, just the flat, factual observation of a man stating what had occurred. Ethan stared at him. The room waited. Outside the parking lot, lights buzzed their endless, almost surrender. The calculation running behind Ethan's eyes was visible from across the room, visible to Megan, who was watching it happen with the focused attention of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds were going to determine the shape of everything that came after them. "You're going to want to sit still," Ethan said, "and be quiet." Jack looked at him with something that was not quite a smile, and not one an expression that lived in the territory between the two. He looked at Ethan the way a man looked at something he had seen before, in a different form, and was recognizing now despite the different packaging. "Boys," Jack said. It was the word more than anything. That specific word, easy and almost affectionate, the word you use for people who were younger than you in ways that went beyond age. The word that placed Ethan and Tyler Voss in a particular relationship to the man speaking it, a relationship they had not consented to and could not argue with because arguing with it would only prove the point. "This isn't the worst decision you've ever made," Jack said, "but it's about to become the most expensive one." The back table erupted. Not loudly, not tauntingly, just a low, genuine laughter of men who had heard a very good line delivered very well, and whose bodies would not let them not respond to it. It moved through the room like a current finding its path, and then it died back, and the silence came again, but it was a different silence now. There was something in it that had not been there before. Tyler spun toward the back table. "Shut up. All of you shut." "Tyler!" Ethan's voice sharp, a warning. "Don't." But the moment had already done what moments did. The men at the back table did not flinch when Tyler turned on them. The man nearest to Tyler, wide through the shoulders, red-beard hands that looked like they had been built for purposes other than the ones he currently used them for, simply looked at Tyler Voss with the patient, slightly disappointed expression of a person watching a child make a choice they could see the end of before it started. Tyler felt the air go out of him in a way he could not explain. He turned back to the counter. Megan had the register open. The drawer sat there, its contents visible. Tyler moved toward it without looking at Ethan, his hands still moving with that fine tremor that refused to stop. He reached the counter. "How much is in there?" Ethan called to her, still watching the room, still running the geometry of it. I don't. Megan's voice was barely there. Roughly. Maybe 400. It's been a slow. Fine. Ethan was moving now, keeping his back toward the wall, trying to maintain the widest possible field of vision. His training, such as it was learned from bad men in bad places, doing bad things and paying for them in ways he was still paying for, told him never to let anyone get behind him. But the diner was working against him. The booths curved. The tables were too many. The men in those booths had not moved, which meant they were everywhere in every direction, and he could not watch all of them. He could not watch any one of them the way he needed to watch people in situations like this, with the full and undivided focus that kept you ahead of what they might do. He reached the counter. He took the cash from the register. He was aware of it as a transaction, aware of the amount being inadequate in a way that sat in his chest like a stone he had been carrying for 3 months and could not put down. Wallets, he said, raising his voice to address the room. All of you, wallets on the tables. Now. Nobody moved. The silence after that instruction was categorically different from the earlier silences. The first silence had been surprise. The second had been something settling into place. This silence was refusal. Simple, collective, absolute refusal, and it had a texture to it, a density, the texture of 40 men who had made a decision without discussing it. Ethan looked at Jack Calhoun. Jack had turned to face the room fully now. His elbow rested on the table. He held his coffee mug loosely, and his expression had not changed, but something in the quality of his attention had the way the quality of water changed when it deepened without a visible change at the surface. I don't think that's going to happen, Jack said. You want to test it. I want to ask you something. The simplicity of it stopped Ethan in a way that a direct challenge would not have. He was prepared for challenges. He had prepared for everything he could imagine. He had not prepared for a question delivered with the calm curiosity of a man genuinely interested in the answer. How long have you two been at this? Jack said. Ethan blinked. His body had no prepared response for this. What? How long? This work you're doing tonight, how long have you been doing it? That's none of your... Because, Jack continued as if the interruption had not occurred, as if the sentence was simply completing itself on its own timeline. You came in here without checking the lot. 41 motorcycles in the parking lot of a 12-seat diner at midnight, and you didn't check the lot before you came in. That tells me you haven't been doing this long enough to develop the habits. And if you don't have the habits yet, you're not doing this because it's what you do. He paused, the specific pause of a man letting something settle before he placed the last piece. You're doing it because something went wrong, something specific. Recently, the room held itself very still. So I'm asking, Jack said, what went wrong? Tyler made a sound. Not a word. Something below a word, something involuntary that came up from somewhere beneath the level of decision from the part of a person that had not yet learned to keep certain things inside. It was a small sound, but the diner was so quiet that it carried. Ethan shot him a look. Tyler pressed his mouth shut. Jack had heard it. He looked at Tyler Voss with a shift in his expression that was not pity and was not condescension and was not the practiced sympathy of a man performing concern. It was the specific look of recognition, the look of a man seeing something he had encountered before in a different face. Son, Jack said, and he was addressing Tyler now directly the way you address someone when you had decided to tell them the truth. When did you last sleep? Tyler's jaw tightened. Don't. When did you last eat a full meal sitting down somewhere? I said don't. How much do you owe him? The diner changed. Every person in it felt the change. That question delivered with that specificity. Not how much do you owe? Not what is the debt, but how much do you owe him? With the article carrying the implication of a specific him, a known him, a him that Jack Calhoun had apparently already identified without being told was not the question of a man guessing. It was the question of a man confirming. Tyler's shoulders dropped. A fraction of an inch. the fraction that was everything. How do you, he started. Because I've seen it, Jack said. Twice before. Different men. Same look. Same kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from wanting things. Comes from being out of time. Megan had stopped thinking about the register. She had set down the coffee pot at some point without noticing. She was watching Tyler Voss's face with the focused attention of someone witnessing a private thing that had been made briefly visible the way you sometimes caught the actual expression on a person's face in the moment before they knew you were looking. Ethan stepped forward. We're not here to talk. I know that, Jack said. But you are talking, because what you came in here for isn't in that register, and some part of you already knows it. $400 doesn't solve the problem you're carrying. It doesn't solve it if it was 4,000. Ethan stared at him. His jaw worked. The mechanical steadiness of his voice had developed a flaw, something small but audible. The sound of a structure that had been under load too long beginning to communicate the load. You don't know what problem we're carrying. 4,700, Jack said. Tyler Voss sat down in the nearest booth. He just sat down. His legs simply stopped agreeing to hold him, and he sat down in a booth in a diner full of Hell's Angels in the middle of a robbery he was actively committing. And he put his face in his hands, and the gesture was so complete and so unguarded that it seemed to belong to a different kind of moment entirely. The kind of moment that happened in private behind closed doors in the dark hours when there was no one to perform anything for. Ethan stared at his partner, then at Jack, then back at Tyler. The plan, whatever shape it had held in his mind through the past 72 hours, the plan he had built and rebuilt and walked through in the small hours of 3 sleepless nights, had not included this moment. None of the contingencies he had run had included a man in a booth who already knew the number. Who are you? Ethan said. His voice had changed. The performance had gone out of it. What was left was just the voice. 28 years old and exhausted and genuinely asking. Jack picked up his coffee mug. He looked at it. He set it back down. Just a man having a late cup of coffee, he said. He pushed the bench across from him out with one boot, a slow and deliberate gesture, the gesture of making room for someone expected. Sit down, son. Let me tell you what I think is actually going to happen tonight. Megan exhaled. She did not realize until the air left her that she had been holding it. She leaned her hip against the counter and found that her hands had stopped shaking, and she could not identify the exact moment that had happened, could not locate it in the sequence of the last few minutes. It had happened somewhere in the conversation, somewhere between the number Jack had said and the sound Tyler Voss had made when he heard it. Ethan did not sit across from Jack. He chose the booth 2 over back against the wall, forearms on the table, the posture of a man maintaining the last available margin. But he sat, and sitting was everything. Sitting was the acknowledgement without words that the room had become something other than what he had walked into it to make it. The diner existed in a suspended state. Nobody had reached for their wallets. Nobody had left. The $400 from the register sat on the counter where Ethan had set it down without appearing to notice he was setting it down, as though the money had become a prop from a play that was no longer being performed. The threat that had come through the door 15 minutes ago had not resolved itself and had not escalated. It had transformed into something that had no clean category, and the room was holding itself in that transformation, feeling its shape, waiting to understand what it was. At the back table, the man with the red beard, whose name was Gerald Pruitt, a 50-year-old retired plumber from Scottsdale who had been riding with the chapter for 8 years and who cried at television commercials featuring dogs, but had never admitted this to anyone, leaned forward with his elbows on the table and his chin resting on his interlaced fingers, and watched the two booths with the focused attention of a man watching the most consequential game he had ever seen played. Beside him, Reed Decker, lean and quiet, the man who had said almost nothing all evening. The man with eyes that were built for listening sat with his arms folded and watched the same thing with an expression that was not readable, but that held weight. Megan picked up the coffee pot. She moved to Jack's booth and refilled his mug without being asked, the way she had been refilling his mug all evening. the way she refilled mugs as a language when she did not have other words available. Jack glanced up at her. Something passed between them that was not a conversation, but that had the density of one. She moved back to the counter. She was aware of the room in a way she had not been aware of a room in a long time, aware of every person in it, and the specific quality of what each person was doing. The held stillness of the men at the booths and tables, the careful watching, the absence of any movement toward resolution or escalation. 40 people who had collectively and without discussion decided to let something happen that had no obvious outcome, decided to stay in the uncertainty of it rather than force it toward a conclusion. She thought about a diner in Albuquerque 8 years ago, a different room, a different version of herself, younger and more alone, and without the particular vocabulary that came from years of learning to read the feeling in your gut before it had a name. Nobody in that room had stayed. Ethan Rowe was watching Jack Calhoun with the expression of a man who had walked into a building and found a different building inside it. Everything he had brought into this diner, the plan, the practiced words, the mechanical steadiness that had taken weeks to build all of it, had been designed for a world in which he understood the variables. He did not understand this variable. He did not have a category for a man who sat in the middle of a robbery and asked questions with the patient curiosity of someone who already knew the answers and was offering you the chance to arrive at them yourself. "You've done this before," Ethan said, not asking, testing. "I've seen it before," Jack said, "which is different." He leaned forward slightly. His voice had not changed in volume, but it had changed in quality, the way a river changed when it narrowed the same water, moving with more force through a smaller space. "Listen to me carefully," Jack said. "What you came in here to do tonight would not have helped her. It would have made her position worse. Because if you're in a cell, there is nobody standing between her and him." He paused. "The only reason you're here is her, not the debt. Her." The sound Tyler Voss made from the other booth was not a word. It came from somewhere below, words from the part of a person that grief reached before language did. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. He looked at the ceiling in the careful mechanical way of someone using every available resource to stay in one piece. Ethan watched his partner. His face did something complicated and private. When he looked back at Jack, the last of the performance was gone. There was nothing left but the question. "So what are we supposed to do?" His voice was stripped bare. No command in it, no manufactured anything. Just a 28-year-old man asking something he genuinely did not have the answer to. "What would you do?" Jack looked at him for a moment. The long, quiet, level look of a man taking the full measure of something before he spoke. "I'd start," Jack said, by not being alone. He turned and looked toward the back table where Gerald Pruitt had straightened slightly and Reed Decker had unfolded his arms. Something passed between Jack and the men at the back table in the way that things pass between people who had been through enough together that communication had become more efficient than language. "Gerald," Jack said. "Birch, come up here." At the far end of the counter, Birch Calloway set down his coffee mug and stood without being asked, because Birch Calloway was the kind of man who understood the moment before the moment announced itself. He was not large in the way that announced itself either. Medium height, lean, with the kind of stillness that came from spending years in rooms where the wrong movement at the wrong time had consequences that outlasted the room. He had spent 7 years as an investigator for the County Attorney General's office before deciding, as he sometimes described it, that he liked the open road more than depositions and the smell of motorcycle exhaust more than the smell of institutional carpet. He crossed the diner without hurry and stopped at the edge of Jack's booth and looked at Ethan Rowe with eyes that were cataloging and patient and entirely without hostility. Gerald Pruitt came from the back table with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had learned that moving slowly in charged situations was itself a form of communication. He pulled a chair from the nearest empty table and set it down between the two booths, the booth where Jack sat and the booth, too, over where Ethan had positioned himself with his back to the wall, and he sat in it with the comfortable authority of a man sitting in his own kitchen. Ethan looked at the two men, then at Jack, then back at Birch. "This is Birch Calloway," Jack said. 7 years with the county AG's office before he decided government work was incompatible with his personality. He knows how men like Victor Harlan operate. More importantly, he knows what makes them stop. Birch looked at Ethan without preamble. I heard everything from the counter. I need you to understand something before we go further. What I'm describing only works if you're both completely in. No half measures. Half measures protect nobody, and they especially don't protect her. Ethan's hands were flat on the table. He was looking at them rather than at Birch in the way that people looked at their hands when they were running a private calculation they did not want visible on their faces. He'll know we talked. Before whatever you do is finished, he'll know. That's how he works. He has people everywhere. So do we, Birch said simply. From the back table without inflection, a voice said, 38 of us, give or take. A beat of silence. Then the same voice. Give or take heavily weighted toward give. The laughter that moved through the room was brief and genuine, the kind of laughter that existed because the alternative was unsustainable. Even Megan, standing behind the counter with her hand resting on the coffee pot, felt it move through her chest before she could decide how she felt about laughing. Ethan did not laugh, but something around his eyes changed slightly, some micro movement that was the beginning of something he was not yet ready to let become visible. Tyler Voss was still in the other booth. He had lifted his face from his hands and was sitting with his forearms on the table now, his eyes red at the edges in the way that had nothing to do with crying and everything to do with a man who had not slept properly in 4 days. He was listening with the full and desperate attention of someone hearing a language they had almost given up on understanding. Walk me through it, Birch said. He reached into his jacket and produced a small notebook. Actual paper, actual pen, which struck Megan as precisely right for the man in a way she could not have articulated but felt clearly. From the beginning, everything. Ethan looked at the notebook, then at the pen, then at the ceiling for one long moment as though locating the beginning of a story required him to find it somewhere above him. 8 months ago, he said, Tyler's mother needed surgery. He paused. Something in the room acknowledged the pause without filling it. The diner held the kind of silence that understood it was being used. Gallbladder. It went wrong. There were complications in the insurance. Ethan stopped. He shook his head once the small, tight shake of a man setting aside an argument he had already lost. It doesn't matter what the insurance did or didn't do. The point is, Tyler needed $4,000 in 10 days, and he didn't have it, and neither did I, and we didn't know anyone who did. From the other booth, quietly without looking up, she almost didn't make it. Tyler said it to the table, to no one, to the record. 2 days in the ICU. I was working a framing crew in Cottonwood and getting paid Friday to Friday, and I didn't have anything close to what they needed, and the hospital was talking about. He stopped. It doesn't matter what they were talking about. It matters, Birch said, not unkindly, just accurately. Tyler looked at him, then he nodded and continued. A guy on the crew, Marcus Tully, he did flooring work, mostly picked up framing jobs when things were slow. He said he knew someone, said it was simple, fast, low rate, in and out in 60 days. He said the guy was almost like a private bank, that people used him all the time, that it was completely, Tyler paused on the word. He said it was completely normal. And it was, Ethan said, for about 6 weeks. Payments were reasonable. The interest was high, but not insane, not enough to flag anything. The man was almost friendly when we met him. Where? Birch asked. Bar in South Tucson. Off the interstate, the kind of place that doesn't have a sign you can read from the road. His name was Victor Harlan. He went by Snake, which we thought was just a road name, the kind of thing everyone had. He pushed papers across the table we signed. He shook our hands. Tyler's mother came home from the hospital 12 days later. Birch was writing. His pen moved steadily without rushing, capturing what was essential and letting the rest pass. Then the first extension request, Ethan continued. 6 weeks in, Harlan said there had been a calculation error, that the original terms had a clause we hadn't understood, that the 60-day structure was actually contingent on a payment schedule, We hadn't been meeting correctly. We had been meeting it exactly. Every payment on time, the full amount. His voice carried the flat, ground-down quality of a man describing something he had replayed so many times it had worn smooth. It didn't matter. He showed us paperwork. The paperwork looked official. We were two guys who worked framing crews and concrete pours, and neither of us had a lawyer to call at 7 in the evening in a bar off the interstate. Second extension, Birch said. Not a question, a prompt. 3 weeks after the first. Same structure, different number. By this point, the principal had effectively doubled because of what he was calling accumulated interest on the adjusted terms. We asked Marcus Tully what we should do. Marcus said, pay it, that this was how it worked, that everyone who used this kind of arrangement went through an adjustment period that it would stabilize. Ethan looked at his hands again. Marcus believed that. I want to be clear about that. He wasn't running a game on us. He genuinely believed what Harlan had told him about how it worked because Harlan had been careful with Marcus, the same way he was careful with us for the first 6 weeks. Make the first part feel real so that when it stops being real, the person you've compromised is already in deep enough that walking away costs more than staying. Birch looked up from the notebook. Reed Decker, who had been standing at the edge of the gathering with his arms folded and his eyes on the middle distance, said quietly, without changing his posture or his expression, he ran the same structure in Pima County 18 months ago. Different names, different amounts, same architecture. I read the deposition. Ethan looked at him. You know his cases? I know the ones that didn't close when they should have. There was a case. There have been several. They close for the same reason they open. The people Harlan targets don't have the infrastructure to sustain a legal fight. They give testimony, they get pressured, the testimony goes quiet, the case goes cold. Reed looked at Ethan with the direct, undecorated attention of a man delivering facts because facts were what the situation required. That's the pattern. Isolation followed by attrition. He doesn't need to threaten people directly. He just needs to make them understand that they're alone. The word landed in the diner with a weight that was felt rather than heard. Alone. Ethan absorbed it. Something moved through his face, some interior rearrangement of things that had been positioned a certain way for a long time and were now being seen from a different angle. Third extension, Birch said, bringing the thread back with the focused patience of someone who understood that focus was a form of respect. Ethan nodded. By the third extension, the number had stopped being a number. It had become a condition, a weather system, something you lived inside of rather than something you dealt with. We were both working double shifts when we could get them. Tyler was doing framing in Cottonwood and picking up drywall work on weekends. I was on a concrete crew as foreman, which was... He stopped. I was good at that job. I was good at it, and I knew I was good at it. And that mattered to me the way things matter when they're one of the few things you can point to. His voice was level. The levelness was doing a lot of work. 6 months ago, I lost it. Not because of anything I did wrong, because the weight of the debt had been leaking into everything for months. The focus gone. The sleep gone. You stop being able to lead other men when you're spending every available piece of your cognitive energy just trying to get through the day without the numbers swallowing you completely. Gerald Pruitt, sitting in his chair between the booths, was looking at the table. His jaw was set. He was the kind of man who absorbed things physically, whose body registered what his face did not display, and the set of his jaw said he was registering this. And then Cassie, Jack said. It was the first thing he had said in some time. He had been sitting with his coffee in his listening present, and still the way a large body of water was present and still containing things without displaying them. When he said Cassie's name, he said it with a specificity that acknowledged what the name carried, what it had cost Tyler Voss to have it attached to this story. Ethan's voice changed when he got to that part. Not broken, stripped. The last layer of management gone, leaving something underneath that had been there all along. The thing the management had been built to protect. 2 weeks ago, Harlan asked us to come to Tucson, not the bar this time, A different place, an office in a building that looked like a legitimate business from the outside, which I think was the point. He sat across from us and he said that he was running out of patience, and that patience had a dollar value, and that the value of his patience had been added to the outstanding balance. The number he gave us was $51,000. Ethan said the number the way you said a number that had long since passed the point of feeling real, with a kind of detached precision. Then he picked up his phone, he turned it face up on the table, and he slid it across to us. There was a photograph on the screen. The diner was so quiet that Megan could hear the coffee percolating behind her. "Cassie," Tyler said from the other booth. The name came out in a single flat syllable, stripped of everything except the weight of what followed it. Walking home from school, 3 days before that meeting. The photograph was taken from a car from the angle of the passenger window, close enough that you could read the logo on her backpack. "He didn't make a direct threat," Ethan said. "He's too careful for direct. He said he hoped everyone close to us was doing well. He said that worrying about family was a natural part of being a man of responsibilities. He said that he would hate for the stress of our situation to spread outward to people who had nothing to do with the arrangement." His jaw tightened to the point of visibility. He said Cassie was a pretty girl. The temperature of the room changed. It did not get louder. It did not produce movement. But something shifted in the quality of the stillness, the way the quality of silence in a forest changed when every animal in it had heard the same sound and made the same decision simultaneously. 40 men became a different kind of still. Gerald Pruitt looked at the table for a moment longer. Then he looked at Tyler Voss, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who had removed all the distance between himself and what he was looking at. "How old did you say she was?" Gerald asked. 17, Tyler said. Gerald nodded once. He reached for his phone. Birch had stopped writing. His pen was still in his hand, but it was resting against the notebook rather than moving across it, and he was looking at Ethan with the expression of a man who had spent years in rooms where people described terrible things and had never entirely developed the insulation that was supposed to make it easier. "He used that exact construction," Reed Decker said from his position at the edge of the group. "The phrasing about worrying spreading outward. Those specific words." He looked at Birch. "Pima County, the deposition I mentioned. The victim described the same language almost verbatim, same sentence structure, same progression from the financial conversation to the mention of a family member." Birch looked at him steadily. "You're saying it's scripted. I'm saying it's practiced enough to be indistinguishable from scripted, which for the purposes of a prosecutor amounts to the same thing." Reed looked at Ethan. "He's done this before, many times before. You are not the first, and you are not intended to be the last. He refined this approach over years of repetition, which means there is a pattern, and a documented pattern across multiple victims in multiple jurisdictions is something a federal prosecutor can work with in ways that a single isolated incident is not." Ethan absorbed this. Something crossed his face that was not quite hope and was not quite its absence. Something in the territory between them that had not yet decided which direction it was moving. "That doesn't solve tonight," he said. "No," Birch agreed, "but tonight is not actually the problem anymore." He picked up his pen again. "I need one more thing from you. The debt documentation. Anything in writing, anything digital, any record of the original terms and the subsequent changes." Tyler Voss reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He produced a phone, not his current phone, a different one, older. The screen slightly cracked along one corner, the kind of phone that had been replaced but not discarded. He set it on the table between himself and Birch's notebook. "Everything," Tyler said. "Every message, every photograph of the paperwork, every payment confirmation. I kept it all on this because I didn't know what to do with it, and deleting it felt like pretending it hadn't happened, and I couldn't—" He stopped. "I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened." Birch looked at the phone for a long moment. He looked at it the way a builder looked at the piece of material that determined whether a foundation could hold what you needed to put on it. "There it is," Birch said quietly. He reached for the phone carefully, the careful way you reach for something that mattered. Jack Calhoun picked up his coffee mug and found it cold and set it back down and looked at Megan. She was already moving, already had the fresh pot in her hand, and she refilled his mug without a word. And the small, ordinary gesture of it was somehow the most human thing in the room at that particular moment. Birch stood and moved to the far end of the counter with the phone in one hand and his notebook in the other. He dialed and turned slightly away from the room, not for secrecy, but for the natural privacy of focused work, the unconscious posture of a man who needed his full attention on what he was saying and could not afford to split it. Gerald was already on his own phone. He was speaking quietly, efficiently, with the confidence of a man calling in a specific favor from a specific account he had been maintaining for years. He caught Tyler's eye as he spoke and gave a small nod that said the thing he was arranging was being arranged. Reed Decker moved to the edge of Jack's booth and sat down in the place Birch had vacated. He looked at Ethan with the direct, uncomplicated attention that was his natural register. Marcus Tully, Reed said. He's still in Cottonwood. Ethan nodded. Doing flooring work. Does he understand what he put you into? Ethan was quiet for a moment. He feels terrible about it. He didn't know what Harlan was when he made the introduction. Or he half didn't know. There's a version where he half knew, and I try not to spend too much time in that version. He paused. He's not a bad man. He made a bad introduction, and he has been living with that. Would he talk to investigators? Ethan looked at Reed, then at Jack. Something in his face was running a calculation that was different from the calculations he had been running all night. A calculation that involved a longer horizon that was trying to look further forward than the next few hours for the first time in months. If he believed it was real, if he believed that talking would actually result in something happening and not just in more exposure for him with nothing to show for it. He stopped. People in our situation, we've been told before that help was available, that someone was going to do something. It usually turned out to be an intake form and a phone number that rang twice and went to voicemail. This isn't a phone number, Reed said. I know that's what you'd say. I know that's what I'd say too, Reed agreed with no defensiveness. And I know that's not sufficient. What's sufficient is different. He looked at Ethan steadily. What's sufficient is the phone Tyler just handed Birch and 7 months of something I don't know about yet that Megan has been building behind that counter. He glanced toward Megan, who had returned to her position and was listening without appearing to listen, which was a skill she had developed over 7 years of working a counter where important things were said. And it's the fact that Birch Calloway just dialed a direct number that connects to a case that has been active for 14 months and that has been waiting for exactly the kind of foundation you two just provided. Ethan stared at him. What case? Reed looked at Jack. Jack looked at Ethan. Let Birch finish his call. The diner waited. The coffee percolated. Gerald wrapped up his call and set his phone on the table with the satisfied precision of a man who had accomplished exactly what he set out to accomplish. Eyes on the house tonight, he said to Tyler quietly enough to be private, but not so quietly that it was secret. Retired deputy I've known 12 years. She'll do a drive-by every hour until morning. Nobody goes near that house without her knowing about it. Tyler looked at Gerald. He looked at this man with his matter-of-fact expression and his phone resting on the table beside a half-eaten slice of pie. And the thing that crossed Tyler's face was not the face of a man receiving charity. It was the face of a man who had been carrying something alone for so long that having someone simply take hold of one end of it without being asked was so unexpected, it almost could not be processed. You don't know us, Tyler said. Gerald shrugged. I know Cassie's 17 and someone took her picture through a car window. He picked up his fork. That's enough. Tyler opened his mouth, closed it again. He read out his address. Gerald texted it to someone without looking up from his pie. At the far end of the counter, Megan Pruitt was not moving. She was standing with her back against the counter and her arms crossed loosely, and her eyes on the middle distance, the particular gaze of a person who was somewhere else inside, while her body held its position. She was thinking about a diner in Albuquerque. She was thinking about the version of herself that had stood behind a different counter in a different room when her ex-husband's debt had become a condition she lived inside, when the phone calls had started, and the man her ex owed money to had started letting her know in the specific indirect way of men like Harlan that he was aware she existed, that her existing was noted. She was thinking about how alone that room had been. She looked at her phone on the counter. She looked at it for a long moment. She picked it up. She looked at what was on it, had been on it for 7 months. The record she had been building in the specific private faith that one day there would be somewhere for it to go. Somewhere it would matter to someone with the authority to use it. Reed Decker spoke from behind her without turning his head. "You've been holding something back." Megan set the phone down. She had not heard him approach the counter, but she was not surprised. Reed Decker had the particular quality of people who arrived precisely when things were ready for them. "Since about an hour ago," he continued, "you did something and you haven't said what it was." She looked at the phone. She looked at the room, at the men in the booths, at Ethan with his hands flat on the table, at Tyler, sitting up now with the slightly dazed quality of a man whose body was beginning to understand that the immediate crisis had changed shape. At Jack Calhoun with his coffee and his stillness, who was watching her now with the same patient attention he had been paying to everything all night. She picked up the phone. She walked around the counter. She stood at the edge of Jack's booth, and she set the phone on the table in front of him, screen facing up, open to what she had been keeping. Jack looked at it. His expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled, the specific settling of a calculation that has been running with one variable missing and has just received the final number. He turned the phone so Birch could see it. Birch, who had just ended his call and returned to the group, looked at the screen. He read what was on it. The longer he read, the stiller he became, and his stillness had a quality to it that was different from the stillness he had been carrying all night. The stillness of someone standing in the presence of something that was restructuring his understanding of the night. "How long?" Birch said. 7 months, maybe a little more." "Talk me through it." Megan looked at her hands on the edge of the table. "After what happened in Albuquerque, I started paying attention differently. To who came through here. To the vehicles, which ones came back, which ones stayed in the lot longer than made sense for a cup of coffee. To the conversations I could hear from the counter when people didn't think about how far their voices carried." She paused. "Two of the men who came through here in the past 7 months, I recognized them. Not from before, not personally. From the way they moved, the way they talked to the people they were with. One of them made a phone call from the parking lot that I could hear through the window, and what he said was not a phone call a legitimate person made." "You documented it," Birch said. "I wrote it down the same night both times. Dates, times, vehicle descriptions, license plate numbers where I could get them physical descriptions of the men. What I saw, what I heard word for word." She looked at Birch. "I know how it sounds. A waitress keeping notes on her phone about strangers in a parking lot." "It sounds like 7 months of corroborating documentation," Birch said. He looked at Jack again, and something passed between them that carried the weight of a significant revision. "The vehicle logs alone are material, but there's something else here." He held the phone slightly, indicating the screen. "One of the plates you logged. I recognize it from the file summary Hollis shared with me 14 months ago. It's a vehicle associated with a collection operation out of Tucson." He set the phone down carefully. "Megan, you have just handed me something I did not know existed 20 minutes ago." The room was very quiet. Ethan Rowe was looking at Megan from his booth. He was looking at her the way you looked at something you had failed to see clearly until it turned toward the light. This woman who had stood behind this counter all night with a coffee pot in her hand and a phone in her pocket, and 7 months of solitary, patient, unwitnessed work sitting in that phone like a question waiting for the right room to be asked in. This woman who had said when Ethan had held a weapon in his hand and demanded she open a register that she would comply without breaking, not because she was unafraid, but because she had decided long ago that fear was not going to be the thing that moved her. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Jack asked her. "I did, once, 8 months ago. An officer took a report. I gave him everything I had at that point, 3 months of notes, 2 license plates, the dates and times." She said it without bitterness, just the flat testimony of a person reporting what had occurred. "I never heard from him again. I called twice, left 2 messages. Nothing." She paused. I decided if they weren't going to build the case, I would build it for them, until it was big enough that someone couldn't put it in a drawer. Nobody said anything for a moment. The silence had the quality of a room acknowledging something that deserved acknowledgement. Then Tyler Voss said very quietly from his booth, "She was doing this alone the whole time." "Yes," Jack said. "For 7 months, in this diner, not knowing if it was ever going to—" Tyler stopped. He looked at the counter, at the ordinary geography of it, the coffee pots and the napkin dispensers and the pie case. She built the case by herself because no one else was going to build it. "That is exactly what she did," Jack said. Ethan was still looking at Megan. Something in his face was completing itself, some interior architecture arriving at a configuration it had been working toward all night. Birch straightened. He looked at the group with the expression of a man who had been handed more than he expected and was reorganizing his understanding of what the night was going to produce. "I need to make a call," he said. "A specific call to a specific person at an hour that is going to require an explanation." He looked at Jack. "Hollis." "Yes," Jack said. "He's going to want them in his office first thing. They'll be there. And Megan's documentation needs to come with them." Megan looked at her phone. "I'll send you everything tonight." Birch nodded. He took a step toward the counter, toward the far end where the work could be done with the privacy it required. Then he stopped. He turned back to the room. He stood there for a moment looking at all of it. The two young men in the booths, the woman at the counter who had been building something in the dark for 7 months on the private faith that it would matter to someone, the men who had stopped for coffee on their way home from raising money for other people's children and had stayed without being asked. He looked like a man who had spent a long career in the business of evidence and procedure and the grinding mechanics of cases that move forward one document at a time, and who was in this specific moment something more than that. Something that all the years of careful professional distance had not entirely trained out of him. "Okay," he said to no one in particular. He turned back to the counter and dialed. Ethan Rowe looked at Tyler. They looked at each other across the narrow space between the booths with the particular intimacy of two people who had been through the same thing from different angles and were trying to locate where they were now relative to where they had been. "You should apologize to her," Tyler said quietly. Ethan looked at Megan. She was at the far end of the counter now, moving with her quiet efficiency, refilling something, adjusting something. The practiced motion of a person for whom the counter was a second language. He stood up from the booth. He walked to the counter. She looked up at him when he arrived, and her expression was neutral, composed, the expression of a person who was capable of waiting to see what kind of moment this was going to be. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, "for what I did when I came in here tonight, for scaring you, for putting a weapon in the same room as you and everyone else in here." He stopped. "You didn't deserve that. Nobody in here deserved that." Megan looked at him. She held the look for a moment that was not quite long enough to be uncomfortable and not quite short enough to be dismissive. "You're right," she said. "We didn't." She let that sit for one beat. Then, "But you're still here. So are we. Let's see what that turns into." She refilled his mug. He went back to the booth. At the far end of the counter, Birch Calloway's voice low and steady. "Raymond, it's Birch. I know what time it is." A pause. "No, listen, I need you to hear this." Another pause longer. "I'm at a diner outside Flagstaff, and I think you're going to want to come in early tomorrow." The diner became something it had not been before. Not louder, not quieter, but different, in the way that spaces were different after something real had passed through them and left its mark. The men settled back into themselves with the particular ease of people who had held a difficult thing and were now permitted to set it down. Gerald had pushed the pie plate aside and sat with his coffee and the comfortable silence of a man who had done what needed doing and required nothing further from the evening. Reed Decker ordered eggs from Megan without making a production of it. Jack Calhoun wrapped both hands around his fresh mug and looked at nothing in particular with the settled expression of a man who had done the thing that needed doing and was now content to let the night become what it was going to become. And at the far end of the counter, Birch Calloway was still talking to Raymond Hollis. And the longer he talked, the more certain it became that the 14 months Raymond Hollis had spent staring at the gap in his case were almost over. But that was not what Ethan Rowe was thinking about when he looked out the window of Coyote Flats Diner at the parking lot full of motorcycles and the empty space where the black SUV had been. He was thinking about a phone call he had not yet made, a call to a man in Cottonwood who had been living with a bad decision for 8 months and who had not been asked yet to do the one thing that might allow him to put that decision down. Ethan looked at his phone on the table. He looked at Jack, who was not looking at him, who was drinking his coffee and paying no visible attention to anything in particular, which was how Jack Calhoun paid the most attention to everything. Ethan picked up his phone. He looked at the name in his contacts, Marcus Tully. He stood up. He looked at Tyler. Tyler looked back at him. Something passed between them that was not a question and not an answer, but the acknowledgement of a decision that had already been made. Ethan walked to the door. He pushed it open and stepped out into the Arizona night, into the cool air, and the sound of the highway in the middle distance, and the parking lot full of 41 motorcycles under buzzing lights. And he stood there for a moment with the phone in his hand and the night around him, and the weight of 8 months of carrying something alone, and then he dialed. The parking lot of Coyote Flats Diner at 2:30 in the morning had a particular quality of silence that was different from the silence inside. Inside, the silence had been populated full of the held breath of 40 people waiting to understand what kind of night this was going to be. Out here, the silence was just the desert doing what the desert did, indifferent and vast and older than anything that had happened in the past 3 hours, by an amount of time that made the past 3 hours feel very small and very significant simultaneously. Ethan Rowe stood between two motorcycles with his phone in his hand and the cool air moving against his face, and he looked at Marcus Tully's name on the screen for a long moment before he pressed call. It rang 4 times. He had expected voicemail. He had prepared for voicemail, had been constructing the words for a message as the phone rang, something that would be clear enough to matter, without being so clear that it frightened Marcus into silence before the conversation could begin. Marcus picked up. Ethan. His voice had the thick, careful quality of a man who had been asleep and had seen the name on his screen and understood that sleep was no longer an option for the immediate future. It's almost 3 in the morning. I know. Are you okay? Is Tyler? Tyler's okay. We're both okay. Ethan paused. He looked up at the sky above the parking lot, the deep, absolute black of the Arizona high desert, in the hours before the world considered morning, the kind of dark that existed only far from cities uncompromised and total. Marcus, I need you to listen to me for a few minutes. I need you to actually listen, not just hear. A silence on the other end. Then, okay. There are federal investigators. They've been building a case against Victor Harlan for 14 months. They have the structure of what he does. They have documentation. They have pattern evidence across multiple victims. What they have been missing is the foundation, the direct testimony of people he targeted, documented in a way that connects his methods across the full arc of what he did to them. Ethan was speaking carefully, not rushing, placing each word with the deliberate attention of someone who understood that the words themselves were the work right now. Tyler and I have been talking to an investigator tonight. We gave him everything. Tyler kept the messages. Megan Pruitt, the woman who works the counter at a diner outside Flagstaff, has been keeping records for 7 months, vehicle logs, dates, incident documentation. The investigator is calling the case agent right now. There is going to be a meeting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Another silence. Longer. Marcus, they need you. The silence on the other end had a texture to it now. Not the silence of sleep, not the silence of someone waiting for more information. The silence of a man who had been carrying something for 8 months and had just been told that the weight of it might have a purpose. What would I have to do? Marcus said. Tell them what you told us, how you met Harlan, what he said when he introduced the arrangement, what he told you about how it worked. You're the connection between him and us. Without that connection, the prosecution has a gap. With it, the gap closes. He'll know. Marcus's voice was quiet. If I talk, he'll know. He's going to know anyway, Ethan said. That's already in motion. The question isn't whether Harlan finds out someone talked. The question is whether what comes down on him is big enough and fast enough that it doesn't matter that he knows. He paused. The case agent has been building this for 14 months, Marcus. He knows what he's doing. He has enough to move. He just needs the floor under it. And I'm the floor. Part of it. Tyler and I are part of it. Megan is part of it. You're part of it. Another silence. Ethan waited. He had learned to wait tonight in a way he had not known how to wait before tonight, with the patience of a man who understood that silence applied correctly was not empty time, but productive time. Time in which the person on the other end of it was doing something necessary. I've been thinking about calling someone for 8 months, Marcus said finally. I just didn't know who to call. Call me back in 5 minutes if you want to. I'm giving you the investigator's number. His name is Birch Calloway. You can talk to him directly tonight if you need to, or you can just show up at 9 tomorrow morning at the Federal Building in Flagstaff and tell them Marcus Tully sent himself. A sound on the other end that was close to a laugh and not quite there. Okay, Marcus said. Okay meaning I'll be there at 9. Tell your investigator to expect me. A pause. Ethan, I'm sorry for what I put you and Tyler into. I know that doesn't... I know, Ethan said. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Get some sleep. He ended the call. He stood in the parking lot for another moment, just standing with the desert air, in the silence, in the sky, and he felt a specific physical sensation of a weight shifting, not disappearing. Weights did not disappear, but changing distribution, moving from the place where it had been sitting for so long that it had started to feel like part of his own anatomy and redistributing itself across more points of contact so that no single point was carrying all of it alone. He went back inside. Jack Calhoun looked up when Ethan came through the door. Just a glance brief and level, taking in whatever was visible in Ethan's face and posture. Then Jack looked back at his coffee without comment. But the quality of that glance, the recognition in it, the acknowledgement of something completed, was more than most men would have offered with a long speech. Ethan sat back down in his booth. He looked at Tyler. He'll be there at 9, Ethan said. Tyler closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, they were different. Some specific tension released from around them that had been there so long Ethan had stopped registering it as tension and had started registering it as just the way Tyler's face looked. You called him yourself. He needed to hear it from me. Tyler nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The understanding between them had the efficient density of people who had been through the same thing from different angles and had developed a shorthand for the territory between what was said and what was meant. At the far end of the counter, Birch Calloway lowered his phone. He stood for a moment looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man integrating new information into an existing structure and finding that the structure was larger than he had understood it to be. Then he walked back to the group and he sat down and he put both hands flat on the table and looked at Jack. Hollis answered on the second ring, Birch said. I assumed he would, Jack said. He's been awake. He said he's usually awake at this hour. Birch paused. I gave him the overview. The testimony, the phone, Megan's documentation, the Pima County connection Reed identified. He listened without interrupting for 6 minutes. Another pause waited. When I finished, he said, tell them they just saved this case. The diner received the sentence in the specific silence of people understanding the full dimension of a thing for the first time. Tyler Voss pressed both hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at them. And then he looked at the ceiling and breathed through his nose in the careful mechanical rhythm of a man managing something large that his body was only partially equipped to contain. Ethan watched him and did not look away and did not try to fill the space with anything, because some moments needed to be what they were without assistance. Megan Pruitt was behind the counter. She had her hand on the edge of it, and she was looking at the two men in the booths with the expression of a woman who had watched something arrive at the place it had been traveling toward for a long time. Her eyes were very bright and very dry. He wants them both in his office at 9 tomorrow morning, Birch continued. He's having a victim advocate present, a woman named Willa Sattler. She's very good. Full protective arrangement. And he's already talking to a judge about an emergency protective order for Cassie that will be in place before she leaves for school Monday morning. Tyler made a sound. It was short and involuntary, and it came from somewhere below the level of decision, from the part of a person where relief lived before the mind caught up to it. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and looked at the table and breathed. Birch looked at Ethan. Marcus Tully. He'll be there at 9, Ethan said. I called him myself. Birch looked at him for a moment with the direct appraising attention of a man recalibrating his assessment of someone. Then he made a note in his notebook and circled it. Good. That closes the last gap I was worried about. Gerald Pruitt raised his coffee mug in Megan's direction. She refilled it without being asked. Gerald looked at the pie case with the expression of a man consulting his conscience and finding it flexible. Any of that cherry left half a pie, Megan said. I feel like the situation calls for it. She cut him a slice. The small, ordinary act of it, the pie and the fork, and Gerald Pruitt eating pie at 3 in the morning, with the comfortable satisfaction of a man who had done a good thing and was at peace with the doing of it, moved through the room like a change in air pressure, a small release of something that had been held for a long time and was now permitted to go. Reed Decker ate his eggs at the counter with the unhurried focus of a man who approached meals the way he approached everything, one thing at a time completely. Jack sat at his booth with both hands around his mug present and still. The diner had found a different temperature now, not the loud warmth of the hours before midnight. That version of the night was irretrievably gone, but something quieter and more deliberate, the specific warmth of a space where people had been through something real together and were living in the careful, slightly dazed aftermath of it, not yet understanding the full shape of what had occurred, but understanding without question that its shape was significant. Ethan and Tyler talked, not to Birch, not to Jack, to each other for the first time in months in a way that was not logistics or crisis management, not the narrow transactional language of two people trying to survive something together. They talked the way they had talked before. Victor Harlan before the debt, before the specific weight of an unsolvable problem had settled between them and slowly compressed everything else out of the available space. Tyler talked about his mother, about the surgery and the days in the ICU, and the particular quality of the waiting room at 2 in the morning when you were the only person in it, and the night had that specific institutional silence that was unlike any other silence. He talked about the moment she had opened her eyes and looked at him and said his name, and how that moment had felt like the whole world reorienting itself around a single fixed point, and how he had never told anyone that because there had been no room for it, no available space in the months that followed for anything that was not the next payment and the one after that. Ethan talked about the concrete crew, about being good at something, genuinely good at it, the specific satisfaction of leading other men through work that required precision and physical intelligence, and the coordination of many moving parts, the way a well-poured foundation felt when you stood back and looked at it, the clean, hard geometry of it, something built correctly and built to last. He talked about watching that version of himself erode, the focus going first, then the sleep, then the quality of the decisions, the small ones that added up in the morning 6 months ago when he had driven to the job site and sat in his truck for 20 minutes, unable to make himself get out, because the weight of everything he was carrying had temporarily exceeded his capacity to carry it and move at the same time. Jack sat at his booth and did not appear to listen, which was how he listened most completely. At 4 in the morning, Gerald Pruitt fell asleep in his chair. It happened without announcement or apology, his chin descending to his chest, his breathing changing quality, and no one in the diner reacted to this, except Reed Decker, who reached over without looking up from his coffee and removed Gerald's fork from his hand before it could fall. At 4:45, Megan started a fresh pot and moved through the diner one more time with the automatic grace of someone whose body knew this space the way it knew its own address. She refilled mugs, she cleared plates. She did the quiet arithmetic of closing that she did every night, the inventory of what the diner had used and what it would need, except that tonight the arithmetic was accompanied by a different kind of accounting, something interior and less quantifiable, a private reckoning with what the night had produced and what it meant that she had been part of producing it. At 5:30, the sky outside the windows began its first conversation with morning. Not light yet, not quite, but the absence of absolute darkness. A suggestion the sky considering the possibility of something other than black. Jack Calhoun stood up. He stood up the way he had stood up earlier in the night, with the deliberateness of a man for whom rising from a chair was a considered act. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the room, at the men who were beginning to stir from their various positions of rest and wakefulness, at Ethan and Tyler in their booths, at Megan behind her counter. He walked to the register and he set down a stack of bills without counting them aloud, without announcing what he was doing, the gesture entirely without performance. Enough to cover every ticket in the diner, every mug of coffee, every plate of eggs, every slice of pie, Ethan and Tyler's coffee included. Megan saw it. She said nothing because some gestures were diminished by acknowledgement. Jack walked to Ethan's booth. 9 o'clock, he said. Birch will drive you. Don't be late. Ethan nodded. We won't. Jack looked at him for a moment. The long, level, quiet look that Jack Calhoun used when he wanted someone to understand that what he was about to say was the truth and not a performance of it. You did a hard thing tonight, Jack said. Not walking in here. That was a desperate thing, and desperate and hard aren't the same. The hard thing was what came after, sitting down when everything in you wanted to keep running, telling the truth when you didn't know yet if the truth was going to cost you more than it saved. He paused. And making that call yourself, to Tully, without being asked. He looked at Ethan steadily. That was the hard thing. Ethan held his gaze. He had the quality in this moment of a man who had been carrying something alone for so long that the offer of acknowledgement was almost more disorienting than the caring had been. His jaw worked. His eyes were very bright. He kept them dry with an effort that was visible and that he made no attempt to hide. Thank you, Ethan said, the two words carrying everything they needed to carry. Jack nodded once. He walked to the door. He paused there and looked at Megan. You did a brave thing tonight, he said. Not just the records, the whole night, every minute of it. Megan opened her mouth. The reflexive deflection was right there, the automatic self-minimizing that 7 years of working a counter had not entirely trained out of her. The instinct to say it was nothing, that anyone would have done it, that she hadn't done anything special. She stopped herself. She felt the stopping of it as a physical act, a small, conscious choice that she was making on behalf of the woman she was becoming rather than the woman she had been. Thank you, she said. Jack nodded. He walked out. One by one, the men followed the way. Large groups left places, not all at once, but in a tide. The back table first, then the counter stools, handshakes near the door. A few words exchanged in voices Megan couldn't quite hear. Gerald Pruitt woke with no embarrassment and stood and stretched and looked around the diner with the slightly oriented expression of a man locating himself in time and space and finding the result satisfactory. He stopped at the counter on his way out and left something beside his plate that Megan did not look at until he was gone. And when she looked, it was more money than she sometimes made in a full Saturday shift. And she stood there for a moment holding it and feeling something she did not have a word for and did not need one. Birch Calloway was the last to leave after Ethan and Tyler, who had gone to his car in the parking lot. He stood at the counter and looked at Megan with the direct, considered attention of a man making a decision. Hollis is going to want to talk to you, he said. Your records, yes, but also your testimony. What you observed in this diner over the past 7 months. You understand that? I figured, Megan said. Are you comfortable with that? She thought about Albuquerque. She thought about the police report that had gone into a drawer. She thought about 7 months of writing things down in the faith that one day the writing would matter alone behind a counter on a 2-lane road under buzzing lights with nothing but the faith itself to keep the work from feeling pointless. Yes, she said. I'm comfortable with that. Birch nodded. He left his card on the counter. He walked out. The door closed behind him and Megan stood alone in the diner for the first time in 9 hours. The lights buzzed. The coffee pot hissed. Outside, the last of the motorcycles moved through the lot and turned onto the highway, and the sound built and peaked and diminished and then was gone. And the road was just a road, and the diner was just a diner, with the chairs not quite pushed in and the coffee cups not quite cleared, and the particular residue of a long night that had been something other than an ordinary long night. She started cleaning up. Raymond Hollis was 58 years old and had spent 30 years in federal law enforcement, developing a relationship with patients that most people would have described as unhealthy. He arrived at his office at 7:30 on Saturday morning, 90 minutes before the meeting, because he had not been able to sleep past 6, and because the case file he had been reading for 14 months looked different to him this morning than it had looked yesterday, and he wanted to sit with that difference for a while before the room filled with other people. He was a compact, deliberate man with the kind of face that disclosed very little and absorbed a great deal. He had learned early in his career that the most important skill in his work was not the accumulation of evidence, but the patience to wait for the evidence that actually mattered, to resist the pressure, to move on what you had before. What you had was sufficient because insufficient cases collapsed in court. And collapsed cases did not just fail, they actively protected the people they had been built against by establishing a legal record that made future prosecution more difficult. He had been waiting for the foundation of the Harlan case for 14 months. He had known the shape of it for almost as long. Harlan's operation was not complicated in its design. Complexity was a liability in his line of work, but it was refined. The structure of escalating debt, the systematic isolation of targets, the careful, indirect threatening that was specific enough to terrorize and vague enough to survive legal scrutiny. None of it was original, but all of it was practiced to the point of fluency. The wire fraud attachment from 18 months ago had established the outline. The racketeering upgrade 4 months ago had confirmed the scope. What Hollis had been missing was the human foundation, a direct victim who had documented the full arc of the targeting from the initial loan through the escalating terms, through the moment the threat became personal in a form that could withstand cross-examination. He had stared at that gap for 14 months. When Birch Calloway's call came at 2:15 in the morning, Hollis had been sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of decaf and the case notes he had read so many times that he had stopped reading them and started simply sitting with them the way you sat with a problem that had become a companion. He had listened to Birch for 6 minutes without interrupting. When Birch finished, Hollis had been quiet for a moment. "Tell them they just saved this case," he had said, because it was accurate, and he was a man who preferred accuracy. Now he sat in his office in the early morning light and looked at the summary Birch had sent him overnight and thought about the specific geometry of what had assembled itself in a roadside diner outside Flagstaff at midnight on a Friday of the accident, and the design of it, the 14 months of careful patient work, meeting the single night of desperate improvisation and producing something that neither alone could have produced. At 9 o'clock, Ethan Rowe and Tyler Voss walked into his conference room. Tyler was wearing a borrowed clean shirt that was slightly too large in the shoulders. Ethan had his hands folded on the table in the manner of a man presenting himself for whatever judgment the room required and prepared to accept it. Willa Sattler, the victim advocate, was already seated to their left, and she had the kind of professional competence that expressed itself as simple human presence, warm and direct, without being performative about it. Birch sat at the far end of the table with his notebook. Marcus Tully sat beside him, arrived at 8:55 with the posture of a man repaying a debt he had been conscious of for 8 months, upright and deliberate and very still. Hollis looked at Ethan and Tyler for a moment before he said anything. He looked at them the way he looked at everyone who sat across from him in this room, with the complete and undivided attention of a man who understood that the people across from him were the most important people. In any case, he worked, because without them, there was no case. There was only paper and theory. "I want to say something before we start," Hollis said, And I need you to actually hear it, not just wait for it to be finished. He paused. What happened to you was not the result of weakness or bad judgment. It was the designed outcome of a system that a deliberate predator has been refining for 15 years. He is skilled at what he does. He identifies people under pressure, offers what appears to be a solution, and then systematically increases the pressure on a schedule gradual enough that by the time the target understands what has occurred, the cost of walking away exceeds the cost of staying. You were not naive. You were targeted. He folded his hands on the table. You are not here because you failed. You are here because you survived long enough to find the right room. Tyler looked at Willa Sattler. She gave him a small, unhurried nod. Ethan said, Birch used that phrase last night. The right room. Birch is a smart man, Hollis said. He opened his folder. Let's work. They worked for 4 hours. Hollis moved through the testimony with the methodical focus of a man who had been waiting too long to afford inefficiency. Ethan and Tyler gave him everything they had given Birch the night before, and then more things that had surfaced in the unguarded hours between 4 and 9 details that had seemed too small to mention until Hollis asked exactly the right question in exactly the right way, and the smallness of the detail dissolved, and what was underneath it was suddenly visible and significant. The escalating interest structure documented in Tyler's messages constituted a textbook predatory lending pattern that the racketeering statute addressed directly. The specific language Harlan had used about Cassie cross-referenced with the Pima County deposition Reed Decker had identified established the template. Megan's vehicle logs corroborated 2 specific incidents that Hollis's investigation had been unable to independently document. Marcus Tully's testimony placed Harlan in the original transaction and established the deliberate deception of the initial terms, the 6 weeks of apparent legitimacy that made the subsequent exploitation possible. At the 2-hour mark, Willa brought coffee. Nobody took a break. At 11:45, Tyler produced the phone. He set it on the table in the same way he had set it on the table at the diner with the same care, and Hollis looked at it with the focus of a man who had been waiting 14 months to arrive at this particular moment. He set it down carefully, the way you set down the thing that changed everything, and moved on to the next question, because there was still work to do before the moment could mean what it was going to mean. At 1:15, Hollis closed his folder. He looked at Ethan and Tyler with the expression of a man who had received substantially more than he had requested and was adjusting his understanding of what the next 11 days were going to produce. The protective order for Cassie will be in front of a judge this afternoon, he said. It will be in place before 8 o'clock Monday morning. He looked at Tyler specifically when he said this because he understood what this sentence meant to Tyler, specifically what it would mean to hear it said out loud by a man with the authority to make it true. Tyler's eyes closed. When they opened, something in them had changed. Something wound very tight for a very long time had released just enough to alter the quality of how he looked at the world in front of him. What about the diner? Ethan said. What we did Friday night. Hollis looked at him steadily. I spoke with the Coconino County Sheriff's Office this morning. The owner of the diner was contacted. He paused. He declined to press charges. Another pause. Several individuals present that night submitted voluntary statements describing the events in terms that were favorable to your circumstances. The district attorney reviewed the situation. Given your cooperation with an active federal investigation, the mitigating circumstances, the voluntary return of the cash, and the absence of any physical harm charges will not be pursued. Ethan absorbed this. He turned his hands over on the table, palms up, and looked at them. The gesture of a man checking what was in his hands and finding something unexpected. We walked in there to steal $400, he said. Not defending it, not explaining it, saying it plainly once the way you said a true thing because it needed to be said accurately at least once. Yes, Hollis said. And instead, yes, Hollis said again. Instead. The silence that followed was the fullest silence of the entire story. Fuller than the silence in the diner when 40 men refused to move. Fuller than the silence when Croft Danning walked out. Fuller even than the silence in the parking lot at 3 in the morning when Ethan had stood under a desert sky and waited for Marcus Tully to answer. This silence had the specific weight of a life that had turned on a single axis, the weight of everything that had not happened because of what had the weight of a version of the next year that no longer existed and the version that had taken its place. Ethan put his face in his hands. He did not make a sound. He was not breaking down. He was not collapsing. He was simply taking a moment that was private and necessary, a moment to be fully inside the weight of it before he had to stand up and carry it forward in a different way. Willa looked at her hands. Hollis looked at the window. Birch looked at the table. Marcus Tully, who had not said much and had not needed to, looked at the wall with the expression of a man paying a debt he had owed for 8 months and finding that the paying of it felt exactly as significant as he had hoped it would. Nobody spoke for 30 seconds. The room held the moment because the moment required holding. Then Ethan lifted his head. His eyes were dry. His face was composed. He looked like a man who had just put something down and was taking careful inventory of how his hands felt without it. "Okay," he said. "What do we do next?" On the evening of the 7th day after that Saturday morning, Ethan Rowe was at his apartment in Flagstaff when he went to his car and found an envelope tucked under the wiper blade. No name on the outside. Inside was a single photograph printed on regular paper. Cassie Voss walking on a sidewalk he recognized as 3 blocks from her school, taken from a car window at close range. The timestamp in the corner said yesterday. Ethan stood in the parking lot of his apartment building and looked at the photograph for a long moment. His hands were steady. They were the hands of a man who had already made his decisions and did not need to make them again. The hands of a man who had sat in a diner at midnight and chosen something different and had been living inside that choice for 7 days and was not going to unchoose it now. He called Hollis. Hollis answered before the second ring. "Ethan, you need to see something." A pause on Hollis's end that was not the pause of a man surprised. "Photograph. You were expecting this." "I was waiting for it," Hollis said, and the quality of his voice was the quality of a man arriving at the moment he had been working toward for a very long time. "Don't touch the envelope more than you already have. I'm sending someone to you in 20 minutes. He paused. "Ethan, this is what I needed. He has just violated a federal protective order. The photograph has metadata, location data, timestamp, device signature. He took it himself or had it taken on a device connected to him." He stopped. "Either way, I have everything I need to move tonight." Ethan looked up at the street light above the parking lot. It buzzed with that same perpetual almost surrender that he had first noticed above the lot at Coyote Flats Diner, that sound that never quite gave up and never quite committed to staying. He had started to think of it as the sound of something that had decided to keep going despite having no particular reason to. "Tonight," he said. "Before midnight," Hollis said. "Get somewhere safe. I'll call you when it's done." He had been sitting with Tyler in Tyler's apartment in Cottonwood when the call came in at 12:14 in the morning. Hollis's voice was the voice of a man delivering the conclusion of a very long piece of work. "It's done," Hollis said. "Harlan is in custody." Ethan looked at Tyler. Tyler was sitting on the couch with his phone already in his hand, already knowing from Ethan's face what the call was before it arrived. And when Ethan said the words out loud, Tyler set his phone down on the cushion beside him very carefully, with the precision of a man handling something fragile. And he put both hands over his face and sat there, in the particular silence of a person at the end of something that has been so long an ending that the ending itself required a moment to become real. They sat like that for a while. They did not need to say much. Some completions were like that. At 11:47 that night, Victor Harlan had been taken from his house in a quiet neighborhood on the south side of Tucson by 4 federal agents. He was handcuffed on his front porch while his neighbors' lights came on one by one in the surrounding houses, the small illuminated sequence of people waking to the sound of official vehicles and understanding that something had concluded nearby. 2 agents carried document boxes through his front door. A third photographed the exterior. The fourth read Harlan his rights in the flat procedural voice of a man for whom this moment was professional rather than personal, which was the correct and appropriate way to conduct it. Croft Danning was taken simultaneously at a motel off the interstate outside Tucson, where he had been staying since the night at Coyote Flats Diner, with the careful awareness of a man who understood that he had miscalculated something significant and had been waiting in a holding pattern to find out the cost. He negotiated with prosecutors within 48 hours, and the names he provided in exchange for his cooperation opened a secondary investigation that spread across 4 counties and implicated a network considerably larger than any single case had previously suggested. One of the names Croft Danning provided was a man who had been deliberately placed on the framing crew in Cottonwood 2 years earlier, a quiet, unremarkable man who had done good work and made introductions and kept his connection to Harlan's operation entirely invisible. Marcus Tully had not known. The introduction he had made had not been accidental on Harlan's side, not an opportunity that had arisen naturally from the circumstances. It had been engineered. Ethan Rowe had been identified and targeted before he knew Victor Harlan existed. When Birch Calloway called Ethan to tell him this, Ethan was quiet for a very long time. "He picked us," Ethan said finally. "He researched you both," Birch said. Tyler's mother's medical situation was accessible through insurance records that should not have been publicly accessible. The timeline of the surgery, the gap between what the insurance covered and what the hospital billed all of it. Harlan used that information to position himself as the solution before the problem had fully formed. He had someone on that crew specifically to make the introduction at the right moment. Ethan was quiet again. He sat with it. He let the full dimension of it arrive without trying to manage the speed of its arrival. "He used her surgery," Ethan said finally. Not a question, just saying it to hear how it sounded said out loud. "He used everything he could find," Birch said. "That's what men like Harlan do. They find the thing you love most and they build the trap around it." "Does Tyler know?" "I was going to call him next." "Let me call him." He did. Tyler was silent on the other end for a very long time, and Ethan let him be silent because he understood what the silence was doing, understood that Tyler needed to sit inside the full weight of this. The knowledge that the thing that had nearly destroyed them had been designed specifically around the thing Tyler loved most in the world, his mother, the surgery, the gap between what she needed and what they had, the precision of it, the coldness of the precision, the specific calculation of a man who had looked at Tyler Voss's life and found the exact place where a lever could be applied. "He used her," Tyler said finally. "He tried to," Ethan said. "He didn't finish." A long silence. "He didn't finish," Tyler said. The words carrying something that was not quite anger and not quite relief, but contained both the way good metal contained both hardness and give. The charges against Victor Harlan were filed 11 days after the night at Coyote Flats Diner. The prosecution included racketeering predatory lending across 3 jurisdictions, witness tampering, and violation of a federal protective order. The prosecuting attorney in her filing specifically referenced Megan Pruitt's documentation as among the most methodically compiled victim-adjacent evidence she had encountered in 15 years of federal cases. Megan received a call from Birch Calloway telling her this on a Tuesday morning. He had heard it from the prosecuting attorney that morning and said he thought Megan should know before she read it somewhere else. She was standing in her kitchen in Flagstaff with the morning light coming through the window above the sink, the specific light of early autumn in the high desert, clean and angled, and certain of itself, the kind of light that did not apologize for arriving. She held the phone for a long time after the call ended. She thought about the woman she had been in Albuquerque, younger, more frightened, standing in a room where nobody stayed and nobody helped, and the police report she had filed had gone into a drawer, and the drawer had closed, and that had been the end of it. She thought about the distance between that woman and the woman standing in this kitchen with this light on her face. She had spent a long time measuring that distance in years and finding the measurement inadequate. It was not measured in years. It was measured in decisions. In the accumulation of small choices made in the dark when no one was watching, and there was no guarantee that the watching would ever come to write it down, rather than let it go to stay, rather than leave to build the record, in the faith that one day there would be a room large enough to hold it. There had been. She made herself a cup of coffee. She went to work. 1 year after the night at Coyote Flats on a Thursday evening in late October, when the sky above Flagstaff had the particular depth of autumn blue that seemed to exist only at elevation, the kind of blue that pressed down on the high desert like something that wanted to be taken seriously. Ethan Rowe pulled into the parking lot of Coyote Flats Diner and sat in his truck for a moment before going in. He was 8 months into a job at a diesel mechanic shop on the north side of Flagstaff, a job he had found through a county employment program that connected him with an apprenticeship certification program, a job that used the same precision and physical intelligence that had made him a good foreman on a concrete crew, and that gave him back gradually and without ceremony the version of himself that the debt had been eroding. His certification was framed on the wall of his apartment, not because he was sentimental about credentials, but because he had earned it and it was his. And the framing of it was a marker, a fixed point in the geography of a life that had been learning to hold still again. The grant that had partially funded the program had come from a debt relief advocacy organization that had received a significant anonymous donation the previous year. Ethan had his suspicions about the source. He had never asked because some things were better carried as gratitude than confirmed as fact, and gratitude was a weight he did not mind carrying. Tyler Voss was already inside when Ethan came through the door. He had arrived first, which was not characteristic of Tyler, and the earliness of it said something about what this evening meant to him without his having to say it. Tyler was working construction in Cottonwood 6 months with the same company, steady hours and steady pay, the simple, reliable arithmetic of work that existed and paid what it said it would pay and did not change the terms 6 weeks in. He drove Cassie to school on Wednesday mornings and had been doing so since she had asked him to, not because she needed the ride, but because she had understood in the way of 18-year-olds who had been through something alongside their families that the driving was not about logistics. It was about Tuesday night knowing what Wednesday morning looked like. Cassie was 18 now. Tyler had told her the full story over the course of 3 conversations, carefully in pieces, because she had the right to know and he had the obligation to tell her. And neither of those things changed the fact that parts of it required care in the delivery. She had listened to all of it without interrupting, with the focused stillness of someone who understood that the story was being given to her and that receiving it properly was its own form of respect. When he finished the last part, she had been quiet for a moment. "Tell me about Jack Calhoun," she had said. Tyler had told her everything he knew. She had nodded slowly, taking it in the way she took everything in completely and without rushing. "I want to go see that diner sometime," she had said. "We will," Tyler had told her. He had meant it, and she had known he meant it, and neither of them had needed to say anything else. Roy Alcott was behind the counter when Ethan came in. He was 63 years old and had built this diner with his father 40 years ago, and had been serving coffee on this 2-lane road for longer than Ethan Rowe had been alive. And he looked the way places looked when someone had been tending them with consistent care for a very long time, not shining, not new, but solid in the particular way of things that had not been abandoned. He had submitted the security footage voluntarily, and without editing all 4 camera angles, the complete 9 hours, with the only instruction being that investigators should take everything and use what they needed. He had said this to the investigators with the quiet finality of a man who had already decided what the night meant and was not interested in having the meaning adjusted. He recognized Ethan and Tyler when they came in, not from the footage, though he had seen the footage. From the way they carried themselves when they came through his door, the specific quality of men who had been somewhere significant and carried the knowledge of it without needing to announce it. He brought them coffee without being asked. "Megan's not working tonight," Roy said, "but she said you might come in, said she left something at the counter." He produced an envelope from beneath the register, both their names on it written in a hand that was precise and careful, the hand of a woman who had spent 7 months understanding that written things carried weight and who had not forgotten the lesson. Ethan opened it. Inside was a single index card. No preamble, no salutation, no explanation of the context that did not need explaining. Just her words in the same careful hand she used when she wrote down what she had witnessed in the faith that it would eventually matter to someone with the authority to use it. You gave me the room I'd been building toward. Thank you for walking in. Ethan read it twice. He folded it carefully along its original crease and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket close to him in the place where things that mattered lived. Tyler looked at the counter where Megan had stood through an entire night, 9 hours long, with a coffee pot in one hand and 7 months of patient, unwitnessed work in the other building. Something alone in the dark on the simple radical faith that eventually the right room would come. He thought about how many people were sitting in the wrong room right now in this country, carrying something alone that did not have to be carried alone, convinced that the walls around them were permanent. Because the walls had been there so long, they had stopped looking like walls and started looking like the shape of the world. He thought about Jack Calhoun on a highway somewhere, engine running, wind moving, going where he was going with the unhurried certainty of a man who understood his direction and had no reason to doubt it. He thought about his mother at home, recovered and careful and alive, who made coffee on Sunday mornings and called him every Thursday and did not know the full extent of what the past year had cost, because some costs were paid by the people who loved you without your knowledge, and that was simply the way of it, and you carried your end without complaint. He drank his coffee. The diner was warm, the road outside was quiet, the sign out front was still missing its second tee, and the parking lot lights still buzzed with their endless, almost surrender. And everything about the place was exactly as ordinary as it had always been, and exactly as extraordinary as one night had made it. And those two things were not in conflict. They were the same thing seen from different distances, which was perhaps the most important thing the night had produced. Not the case, not the arrest, not the 14 months of patient work arriving at its conclusion, or the 11 days between a midnight diner and a pair of handcuffs on a front porch in Tucson. Not even the charges or the sentencing that would come later, or the secondary investigation that was still unfolding across 4 counties and would continue to unfold long after anyone in this story stopped paying attention to it. The most important thing was simpler than any of that, smaller and larger simultaneously. The thing that 40 people in a roadside diner had demonstrated without planning to demonstrate it and without knowing they were demonstrating anything at all. That the most powerful thing one person could offer another was not money and not rescue and not the removal of all consequences. It was the refusal to let them be alone in it. That was what Jack Calhoun had offered 2 young men at midnight with nothing more than a cup of coffee he kept drinking and the willingness to turn around when spoken to. That was what a room full of strangers had offered without being asked and without expecting anything in return and without making a production of the offering. That was what Megan Pruitt had been building toward for 7 months behind a counter on a 2-lane road in the high desert of Arizona, alone in the dark for an audience of no one, on the simple and radical faith that eventually the right room would come and the work would find its purpose, and the record she had been keeping would matter to someone who had the standing to use it. It did. And when it did, it was enough. It was more than enough. It changed everything.